Good evening. This is the 82nd meeting of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group, and this is my clap for sound synchronization. And so the first thing to remind everyone is that we will be conducting our advanced reading group sessions Tuesdays at 1:30 in the afternoon Eastern Daylight Time instead of Thursdays, which is what our previous schedule had been. And the first thing I wanted to mention is that today I got in the mail my own copy of the whole Secret of the Golden Flower. Not only we've been referring to the version of it which appears in Alchemical Studies, which is volume 13. Yes, volume 13 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung, published by Princeton University Press, but that only contains the Carl Jung commentary. But today I got from Used Books, I think it might be out of print, The Secret of the Golden Flower, a Chinese Book of Life, translated and explained by Richard Wilhelm, with the commentary by C.G. Jung. And as you see on the cover, it has a mandala of the golden flower. And I was sort of taken with the translator's preface here. This was translated quite a while ago. It was translated by Carrie Baines, who was one of Dr. Jung's very early and closest apostles. And so it was translated in March of 1931. And so I just wanted to read a couple of things that she had to say about the book. The original German, this is called Translator's Preface. The original German edition of The Secret of the Golden Flower, of which the following is the authorized English translation, appeared first in the autumn of 1929. On March 1, 1930, Richard Wilhelm died. In May 1930, memorial services were held in Munich, and Jung was asked to deliver the principal address. The latter finds an appropriate place in the English version, which is published a year or more after the co-author's death. The address will be welcomed, but only for what it tells the reader of Wilhelm, but for the further light, not only for what it tells the reader of Wilhelm, but for the further light it throws on the standpoint of the East. The relation of the West to Eastern thought is highly paradoxical and confusing one. On the one side, as Jung points out, the East creeps in among us. The East creeps in among us by the back door of the unconscious and strongly influences us in perverted forms, and on the other, we repel it with violent prejudice as concerned with a fine-spun metaphysics that is poisonous to the scientific mind. If anyone is in doubt as to how far the East influences us in secret ways, let him but briefly investigate the fields covered today by what is called occult thought. Millions of people are included in these movements, and Eastern ideas dominate all of them. Since there is nowhere any sign of a psychological understanding of the phenomena on which they are based, they undergo a complete twisting and are a real menace in our world. A partial realization of what is going on in this direction, together with the Westerner's native ignorance and mistrust of the world of inner experience, builds up the prejudice against the reality of Eastern wisdom. When the wisdom of the Chinese is laid before a Westerner, He is very likely to ask with a skeptical lift of the brows why such profound wisdom did not save China from its present horrors. Of course, he does not stop to think that the Chinese asks with an equal skepticism why the much boasted scientific knowledge of the West, not to mention its equally boasted Christian ethics, did not save it from a world war. But as a matter of fact, present conditions in China do not invalidate Chinese wisdom, nor did the Great War prove the futility of science. In both cases, we are dealing with the negative sides of principles under which East and West live, and it has not yet been given either to individuals or to nations to manage the vices of their virtues. Mastery of the inner world with a relative contempt for the outer must inevitably lead to great catastrophes. Mastery of the outer world to the exclusion of the inner delivers us over to the demonic forces of the latter and keeps us barbaric despite all outward forms of culture. The solution cannot be found either in deriding Eastern spirituality as impotent or by mistrusting science as a destroyer of humanity. We have to see that the spirit must lean on science as its guide in the world of reality, and that science must turn to the spirit for the meaning of life. Such is the point of view established in this book. Through the combined efforts of Wilhelm and Jung, we have for the first time a way of understanding and appreciating Eastern wisdom which satisfies all sides of our minds. It has been taken out of metaphysics and placed in psychological experience. We approach it with an entirely new tool and are protected from the perversions the East undergoes at the hands of cult-mongers of the West. At the same time, its meaning for us is greatly deepened when we know that despite the gulf separating us from the East, we follow exactly similar paths when once we give heed to the inner world. But this book not only gives us a new approach to the East, it also strengthens the point of view evolving in the West with respect to the psyche. The reshaping of values in progress today forces the modern man out of the nursery The reshaping of values in progress today forces the modern man out of the nursery world of collective traditions into an adult's world of individual choice. He knows that his choice and his fate now turn upon his understanding of himself. Much has been taught him in recent years about the hitherto unsuspected elements in his psyche, but the emphasis is all too often on the static side alone, so that he finds himself possessed of little more than an inventory of contents, the nature of which serves to burden him with a sense of weariness rather than to spur him on to master the problems that confront him. Yet it is precisely the need of understanding himself in terms of change and renewal which most grips the imagination of modern man. Having seen the world of matter disappear before his scientific eye and reappear as a world of energy, he comes to ask himself a bold question. Does he not contain within his psyche a store of unexplored forces, which, if rightly understood, would give him a new vision of himself and help safeguard the future for him? In this book, his question is answered from two widely different sources, Chinese yoga and analytical psychology. Stripped of its archaic setting, The Secret of the Golden Flower is the secret of the powers of growth latent The secret of the golden flower is the secret of the powers of growth latent in the psyche, and these same powers, as they reveal themselves in the minds of Western men, also form the theme of Jung's commentary. In the commentary, he has shown the profound psychological development resulting from the right relationship to the forces within the psyche. So I'm reading from the actual book, The Secret of the Golden Flower, and that was the translator's note by Carrie Baines, dated 1931. Now, this particular edition came out in 1961, and so in it, there's a foreword to the 5th German edition, which has been translated, and this foreword is written by Salome Wilhelm. I don't know what Salome's relationship to Richard Wilhelm. I'm sorry, I'm sure we can all find it. Hi, Dan. Nice to see you this evening. Okay, so this is short, but I wanted to read it to you. This particular edition of The Secret of the Golden Flower, Chinese Book of Life, translated by Richard Wilhelm, with the golden flower mandala on the cover, I believe is out of print, but I was able to get it from used books on Amazon, and so you may be able to find it there as well. In this particular edition, which was published in 1961 by Harvest Books and Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, New York and London. So in this particular book, which is a paperback, Salome Wilhelm says this, she's referring to the fact that there's another text in this version of The Secret of the Golden Flower also, and this which I'll explain here quickly. Richard Wilhelm wrote the following brief introduction to this meditation text in 1926. Quote, "The Hui Ming Qing, or Book of Consciousness and Life, was written by Liu Huayang in the year 1794. The author was born in the province of Jiangxi and later became a monk in the monastery of the Double Lotus Flower in the province of Anhui. The translation is from a new edition of 1,000 copies printed with The Secret of the Golden Flower. In 1920, published with The Secret of the Golden Flower in 1921 by a man with the pseudonym Hui Chen-tzu, which translates to be "He who has become conscious of truth." The text combines Buddhist and Taoist directions for meditation. The basic view is that at birth, the two spheres of the psyche, consciousness and the unconscious, become separated. Consciousness is the element marking what is separated off, individualized in a person, and the unconscious is the element that unites him with the cosmos. The unification of the two elements via meditation is the principle upon which the work is based. The unconscious must be inseminated by consciousness, being immersed in it. In this way, the unconscious is activated, and thus, together with an enriched consciousness, enters upon a superpersonal mental level in the form of spiritual rebirth. This rebirth then leads first to a progressing inner differentiation of the conscious state into autonomous thought structures. However, the conclusion of the meditation leads of necessity to the wiping out of all differences in the final integrated life, which is free of opposites. Okay, she goes on to thank some people, but I thought that would be interesting to hear those two perspectives on the secret of the golden flower as it actually exists. And in this edition, Dr. Jung's commentary appears at the end of the book instead of at the beginning by his own choice and request. Okay, so I see we've gathered a few of us here, and so I'm going to go back and again, this is part 2 of our series on the secret of the golden flower, which starts to amount to a sort of prelude to all of Jungian psychology in one way or another. And so this is why I'm taking it so seriously. And we're only up to paragraph 7 out of 71 paragraphs. And so let me just, I'll repeat very briefly. In paragraph 7, we were talking about confusing the spirit with instinct. And actually, those are on two ends of a continuum. And and you can feel the spirit when you either go to an art store or maybe the tool department in Sears. The spirit is greater than the intellect. And I know when I go in those places, I say, wow, I want all these things in my life. And so it includes feelings too. And what I've found is that my life works better when I'm doing something creative, whether it's woodworking or whatever it is. I've tooled leather handbags. I've done paintings. I've done writing. I'm doing this YouTube channel now, and all these things are creative processes that seem to make my life work better. I don't know why. It's a mystery. But one way to get into that, very simply, is just go to your local bookstore and buy an adult coloring book. Believe it or not. I mean, if you want to get in touch with yourself, this is the easiest way to do it if you don't have any clue how to do it. Just go buy an adult coloring book and buy a simple 24 color set of colored pencils, and go home and you look at the spaces in the adult coloring book that are empty. And so look at one empty space, then look at your group of pencils and let your psyche select the color for that space. So just let your hand sort of go across the pencils and then just put your finger down on the right color. Pick it up, fill in that color, go on to the next blank space. And my experience was that after I did that for an hour and I had filled in my first mandala, I happened to buy or was given an adult coloring book with mandalas in it. And so I was nearly complete. But suddenly I began to sob, and that's a sure sign that you've touched some complex or some part of the self. And so there's a beginning to showing to the self that you want to be more connected to it. And one of the problems that we have is the more we get into the scientific method, the less we want to be in contact with instinct and the self and spirit. And so in terms of in terms of Jungian psychology, the self is the guiding principle. It strives to superhuman shining heights. And so we have to question the spirits, because the spirits come out in two streams. One stream is positive and one stream is negative. And so it's important to have a strong ego and to make conscious moral decisions about what's coming out of your psyche, whether it's something that you want to bring into the world or something you don't want to bring into the world. And it can be pretty shocking what comes up, actually. What happens with the yin instinct in the yin-yang idea is that the yin instinct reaches back for the depths emotionally and instinctually. It looks for the depths of time. And so you can go way high on the yang parameter, but when the yang gets to high noon, it starts back toward the yin, and so night begins at high noon. And that's an important concept to remember. Now, one thing tonight, I'm not putting my notes up on the screen with you because it was constantly flashing last time, and I don't want to cause anybody any epileptic seizure or anything like that. But I am going to put up some images from time to time through this evening. And so let me just quickly look here. Miles says, apparently Kundalini yoga brings out strong emotions too. People just need to know it's normal. Yeah, I would say that's true. Dan says, I now understand what you meant when you mentioned the yin-yang symbol in our discussion on marriage as a psychological relationship. Hi, Bree. Welcome too. Okay, so one important thing is that we have to keep the opposites in balance. I'm going to show you this. This is an alchemical picture. It's from 1582. I particularly like this picture because I think that it very strongly represents what Dr. Jung was talking about. And I'll show you something about the continuum between instinct and spirit in a minute, but the point is that, and by the way, I keep remembering this image and then I keep forgetting where it is, and I've spent literally hours looking in my library trying to figure out what book it was in. I finally found where it is. It's in Esther Harding's Psychic Energy. That's the book that has this image. And so what this image represents is, in the center, you see an alchemical vase. And in that vase are 3 live dragons, represented as one white, one black, and one red, I suspect, although it's a black and white image. And those represent the instincts within us, our animal instincts. Yeah, let me see if I can center myself a little bit better here. And then all around it, on all sides of that image, is civilization. And so you see medieval civilization carrying on with merchants and various other things happening in a civilized society, and flying over, you see the energy of the sun. And so this is called Splendor Solus, and it represents the fact that, we have this psychic energy in it, and the psychic energy doesn't happen unless you have instinct. So you have to have that instinct, but keep it under control. And that's the issue. So anyway, the point that Dr. Jung is making here is that the opposites always need to be in balance. And when they are, that's a sign of high culture in a society. But widening consciousness, the widening of consciousness beyond tyrannical intellect, karma, when we widen our consciousness, then the self, reaches for the stars, as I mentioned, and it may go too far. And then karma tends to pull us back. And we have to remember that the universe is in balance. So if you have some great good fortune, Dr. Jung would probably urge you to give it away as quickly as possible, or to make other gifts to other people, because if you don't, then karma might eat you up. And so anyway, that is Splendor Solus. Okay, so going on to paragraph 8. At this time, Dr. Jung thought of Eastern psychology as childish, but then he said that, Christ had a saying, which was that unless you experience things as little children, you won't appreciate what I'm talking about. And so the Eastern method is a method of learning from the ground up. And I'm going to share that with you in a moment. Let's see when it comes up here. Well, I don't want to wait that long, so I'm going to show you this next picture here. So this is an image of my great-grandmother and her 3 sisters. The note on the back of this picture, and their father, and the note on the back says this was taken in 1879. And so the woman in the lower front, seated on the left, is my great-grandmother, Louisa Dockstader, at the time. And these are her 3 sisters. And the 2 women standing, I knew in my lifetime. By the time I came along in the 1950s, these women were in their 80s. But I did know them, and they lived in my original hometown of Cazenovia, New York. And this picture was taken in front of our farmhouse there. And the woman on the right married a man from Holland, Michigan. Obviously, this is a very Dutch community in northern New York. If you go across northern New York, the Erie Canal, you'll find all these cities named Amsterdam or Rotterdam or whatever it is. And so the gentleman there is my great-great-grandfather, I guess, Joseph Dockstader. And my point in showing you this picture is that changes in style have to happen when they're pushed through, as when there's what Dr. Jung keeps calling a sine qua non, and that means that the spirit has to change this. And so here are American farm women. They didn't have a very rich life. I mean, our farm in my grandfather's life. So, my great-grandfather's life. So Louisa's husband, Samuel Conover, was a dairy farmer, and he farmed 23 cows, and he actually stopped that in 1941. He actually retired right before the beginning of World War II. And the farm was then closed up for 15 years while Americans went off to war. But over this now century and a half, we see how American women have become much freer about their attire. But if you think about Saudi women, for example, or women in the Middle East, Muslim women, they're typically wearing attire that's very similar to this in many ways, including all black, as you see. These are all black outfits that these women have on. And so the point is that those changes have to come from within. They can't be forced upon you by society. That's the point of showing you this picture. So, anyway, the final point of paragraph 8 then is it's better to evolve in our own instinctive nature rather than to force things. And at least this is Dr. Jung's position. Now, Dan says, I like Dr. Jung's message that Westerners shouldn't betray who we are, but rather use who we are as a starting point from which we can understand that the East has something to offer us. And I think that's very true. And, in my own experience with Saudi Arabia, I've probably been there 6 months of my life on 23 different visits. I think the, Muslims have a lot to offer us too. But we first have to open our mind to that. To me, the message is less objectionable than being told to reject our Western ways, the concept of the ego included. Absolutely. There's the issue of what is the ego. And here in Jungian psychology, we're not talking about hubris. Okay, so the ego is everything that you have in consciousness. So we're certainly not talking about giving up the ego. We are talking about having a wider consciousness that allows us to understand that there is some other force, may the force be with you, that is coming up inside of us in the form of what Dr. Jung would call the spirit. And that spirit is gradually changing us. And yes, Greg, there has to be a balance within that, obviously. So anyway, going on to paragraph 9, from an externalistic standpoint, we cannot understand the East. And that's an issue. I go to a Buddhist meditation class every Monday at noontime. And one of the things that gets under my skin about it is how passive Buddhism is and how passive it makes its followers, or seems to. But they try to understand wholeness, and they haven't been separated as much from the instinctive side in their spirituality as we have. And so that's one of the points of this evening, which is that in order to have wholeness, we have to have both the instinctual side and the spiritual side. And, we see that playing out in our politics, among other places. Now, from Dr. Jung's point of view in 1929, or whenever he was writing this, even scholars think the I Ching is filled with abstruse magical spells. And what he's saying is that modern psychology offers a path to understanding. And so it so happens that I also got a copy of the I Ching today. And so this is the I Ching, which is translated by Wilhelm and into German, and then by Carrie Baines into English. And this was published by Princeton University Press a long while ago. The cover of it is quite damaged, and it has a price of $7.50 in the dust cover, so that is a long while ago. But anyway, it appears to be an interesting book, and I'm looking forward to reading it over time. I'm not anywhere near ready to consider doing a class on it, but I thought I would get it since we're talking about these things. And then the other thing I got last night as a gift was the Scientific Tarot, and that's in the other room, so I won't show it to you, but it's really challenging my understanding of Tarot. And I'll share that with you maybe next week, just show you the deck. It's very interesting. Okay, so paragraph 10, Dr. Jung admits he was completely ignorant until Richard Wilhelm arrived. But Dr. Jung's clinical technique, what the Chinese had come up with, what the Chinese had followed for centuries. And so the images that had come up in his consulting room were the same as the images that were described in the I Ching and in The Secret of the Golden Flower. So he says, quote, its contents form a living parallel to what takes place in the psychic development of my patients. And so there's this instinct continuum scale. And actually what I'm going to do, that's not a very good way to show it to you. I want to talk for a minute because we are talking about Dr. Jung's practice a little bit. I want to show you the psychoid layer. So I think I can show you that without too many flashes. And there's some bonus material about this in the advanced reading group. But just to give you an overall perspective, I think it's useful to understand these three sources of psychic healing. And I'm just going to leave this up for another minute or so because the flashing is irritating. And so if you're watching this on video replay, please go back to where I'm showing it and just stop the video so that you can read it if you want to. But the flashing is going to get too much otherwise. Okay, so this perspective on the psychoid layer comes from this book, The Psychoid Soul and Psyche, Piercing Space-Time Barriers by Anne Belford Ulanoff. And Dr. Ulanoff is Emerita Professor of Psychiatry and Religion. I had a guest on my arm here. In my Buddhist way, I hope he's going on to his the rest of his life here. So anyway, I thought it was interesting because she talks about 3 activities that analysts use to help analysans in the psychological therapy room. And so the first is to help the analysan know that they're experiencing something that many others also suffer. And so, this may be an immature person who doesn't realize that whatever trouble they have in their life is something that happens to lots of people. And that in itself can be curing. And I'm sorry, I'm going to take that off the screen, but please go back to it if you're watching the replay. Okay, the second source of psychic healing is that the analysan is connected to a religious outlook again. And there's this famous quote that Dr. Jung gave at one point, in which he said, "Among all my patients in the second half of life, that is over 35, none of them has really been healed who did not regain his religious outlook." And so that's in an essay called Psychotherapists or the Clergy by C.G. Jung. It's found in volume 11 of the Collected Works, paragraphs 488 to 538. And you can find it in the Dropbox for them's knows. And if you are not in our general Dropbox, you can send me an email. I will give you my contact information. You can send me an email, and I will be happy to include you in our general Dropbox. We also have a separate Dropbox for the advanced reading group. But anyone who can hear this now is welcome to join our general Dropbox. Okay, so moving along. So the third source of psychic healing, according to Dr. Ulanoff, is to experience the psychoid layer. And she describes the psychoid layer in four ways. So these are, in effect, psychic facts, like Dr. Jung uses psychic facts. And so the first of these psychic facts is, number one, it cannot be perceived directly. It cannot be represented by word or image. It is unknown and unknowable. And so the archetypes are example of psychoid events, and they are identical in all individuals across the human species. And many of them also are easily seen in other species. They are only known through behavior, emotion, and image generated. And so that's the first idea, which is that archetypes themselves, we cannot clearly define them. We can define them in some ways, but we can't clearly define them as, there's no way to just write down and have every element of an archetype. So number two, it manifests both physically and psychically. And what that means is it's two sides of the same coin. It's experienced in opposition. And so on one end of the spectrum, it's instinctual, and on the other end of the spectrum, it's spiritual. And what she says is this is the scale along which consciousness itself slides. I have a favorite image, which I didn't prepare for tonight, but what it shows is the Decorah Eagle. As you know, there are many of these new webcams on explore.org and various other places where you can watch the life cycle of many different species. And my wife and mother-in-law have been particularly taken with this, and one of the ones that you can watch is called the Decorah, as in Decorah, Iowa, Decorah, Decorah, Iowa eagle. And there's an eagle's nest there that's been there for several years. And last year, in February, they have an infrared camera on it, so we can see the eagle at night, even though she doesn't know that she's being filmed. But she has a infrared spotlight on her, so for us, she's very clear. And it had snowed, and she's sitting there with this. She's really hunched down on her eggs, and on top of her head is about an inch of snow, and she's not moving for anything. And that's an example of this mother archetype. And obviously she's not a human being, but that's it's a behavior that you can observe in almost any species, certainly any species that you can observe on explore.org. You can see the mother archetype everywhere in nature. So number 3, experience confirms it, and it opens onto the unus mundus. So I'll just read these points and then I'll come back. So it's one world where the familiar binary ego no longer obtains. In other words, there's a relationship that's going on. In the case of a therapist in a therapy session, you're in the moment and everything else falls away. And obviously, if you've ever had a lover or someone who you wanted to attract to be a mate, sometimes if you go out to dinner, you're having a conversation with that person and everything else falls away. You know, the waiter comes up next to you and has to shake you to get your attention because you're not even seeing the waiter. And so these also come out of, these experiences come out of synchronicity, non-causal events, and they're religious experiences, and they give you a sense of meaning. And Dr. Ulanoff assures us we did not invent these. This is a land beyond space and time. So again, you know, from any conversation with a lover or whoever, if you're having a good conversation, space and time disappear. And so the famous one in Dr. Jung's life was when he met Dr. Freud for the first time and they spoke for 13 hours nonstop. That was an example. And she says it can be lived but not represented. Well, I'm going to take slight exception to that because I have managed to catch 2 of these on video for sure, and another one on photos. And probably most of the people that are watching this right now have seen these have seen this, but in any case, if you look up synchronous and numinous on the YouTube channel, in fact, I guess I probably ought to just, while I'm here, I probably ought to just give you the link so that everybody has the link. But you will see one of these events actually happen to me, and there's a playlist on the channel called Breakthroughs to the Unconscious, and there I have several videos that are related to this point, but what I want to give you is one specific video. And I'll give you the link here in just a moment. Yoo-hoo. Impossible just takes a little longer. So this was you may not think it's very impressive, but I think it's incredibly impressive. And I've had a number of Jungian analysts tell me that it was pretty impressive. And so here's the link to the video. You can watch on your own time if you haven't watched it before. It's the video that has the Navy's Blue Angels in the first image of it. And so that was one of these psychoid experiences for me. And in order to appreciate how this affected me, you need to listen to the very first sentence in the video. And then you can start at about 2 minutes and 9 seconds into it. You can see the actual event. And then at about 4:55, you see how the emotion starts to work on me. In fact, you see it immediately through the next 3 minutes of the video, but you can see how the emotion works on me in terms of the meaning of that particular synchronicity, which is certainly this kind of experience that she's talking about from the psychoid layer. And so the fourth point is that it transgresses all boundaries. So it's a seed for future consciousness, number one. So obviously it was a seed for me immediately. And for those of you who've watched the video in the past, you'll see it there. And as I said, in this Breakthroughs to the Unconscious playlist, you can find another video and several other references to this kind of event that I have caught on video or on imagery and cameras specifically. But she says the boundaries can be known only approximately. It can be in circumstances, which it is in my video, and it can be liberating. It breaks the usual ways of knowing. And boy, there's no doubt in my mind that this was definitely a religious experience for me, a very profound experience. And when you listen to it in the juxtaposition of what I was reading and the perfect timing of it, you almost can't have any doubt. And one thing that you can be very sure of is that nobody can fake that one. Nobody. Okay, Jerome says, Jung used the term psychoid to characterize the fact that the archetypes of the objective psyche sometimes seem to cross over into the realm of matter, meaning, and order. Yes, I'm sure that's true. Dr. Ulanoff is saying that she's taking this a step further, basing her ideas on Jung, but she says this is really her idea of the psychoid. So it's not purely Jungian, although she is, obviously a past master Jungian of the first order. Okay, so in paragraph 11, we get reference to the human psyche. And obviously one of the biggest problems Dr. Jung had in his lifetime was to get other people to agree that the psyche is real. And so he says that explicitly in paragraph 751 of Answer to Job. And, he says very clearly, and I'll just refer you to it since I have Answer to Job right at my fingertips. It being one of the most important books of Dr. Jung's oeuvre. Okay. All right. So he says, what people overlook or seem unable to understand is the fact that I regard the psyche as real. They believe only in physical facts and must consequently come to the conclusion that either the uranium itself or the laboratory equipment created the atom bomb. That is no less absurd than the assumption that a non-real psyche is responsible for it. God is an obvious psychic and non-physical fact, i.e., a fact that can be established psychically, but not physically. Okay, so anyway, that's the profound page on, on Answer to Job. So what Dr. Jung is admitting is that he had been researching on the collective unconscious since 1913, and he was trying to prove it and have some parallel to it from elsewhere in human experience. He hadn't been able to connect it up properly with the Gnostics because the information about the Gnostics was... When he was writing this, the information about the Gnostics was not clear enough. And so, of course, in 1945, so less than two decades later, the Nag Hammadi library, I guess it's library, the find that they had in Egypt occurred, and they found the gospel according to John, I think, and they found some other gospels that never became part of the Bible because they were found in 1945, and the Bible was settled in 325. But anyway, but the point is that these items of the psychoid transcend all differences of culture and consciousness, and their latent presuppositions toward identical reactions. And so, as you can imagine, the Decorah Eagle shows us what how a mother behaves. It's the psychic expression of the identity of the brain structure regardless of racial differences and parallelism among animals. And the examples are the mother archetype and the warrior archetype. Okay, look. Right, and Gray, that's the point. It is a biological claim as well as a psychological claim. So it's a continuum that starts in the instinct, which is a biological claim, over to the spiritual, which is a psychological claim. And paragraphs 11 to 25 in this commentary on the Golden Flower each separately set off an atomic bomb in my mind. Shouldn't Dr. Jung's writing come with a warning? Fair enough. I mean, he's been blowing my mind for years. That's all I can say. Okay, so in paragraph 12, what he's saying is, in psychological terms, we have common instincts of ideation and action across the whole human species, all based on unconscious archetypal patterns. It's stronger than our will. The instincts remain more or less constant. And one of the big points he makes here is that the more unconscious these instincts are, the more the psyche is conservative. That is why primitives do not change over thousands of years, because they fear the strange and unusual. And there's a famous yeah. I'm not going to repeat that with the word in it for the video, but if people can see the chat, they can read it for themselves. But anyway, there's a famous Buddhist story where the famous Buddhist story is that there's a frog that lives in a mud puddle, and an older frog comes by and he says, we ought to go hop over here and see the pond. And the young frog says, well, this one seems pretty good. I'm going to stay here. And the older frog says, no, come on and see the pond. So they hop over to the pond, and the young frog says, wow, that's really awesome. This is great, wonderful. And the older frog takes him out and shows him the ropes of the pond. And then the next day he says, well, let's go see a lake. And the younger frog says, well, I can't imagine anything bigger than this pond. And the older frog says, well, come along, come see. And so they hop over, and then they see a lake. And then the next iteration, they see the ocean. And in the Buddhist story, when the young frog sees the ocean, his mind just explodes. So that's kind of what you and Dan are talking about here, where the more consciousness you get, the more frightening it is. And so one further point in this paragraph 12 is the higher and wider consciousness gets from assimilation of unfamiliar, the more autonomy it gets. And so what happens is it rebels against the old gods who held their consciousness in thrall. And so the more, your consciousness is contained, let's say, as Dr. Edinger discussed in one of his lectures, and it's either contained in a religion or in a perspective on your world, as the frog had. But once your mind has stretched out, then you can't go back. And so whatever was holding you in thrall before, you can't go back. It's like going to university and then trying to go back to your hometown. Let's suppose that you live in a Ohio farm community, and then you go to Columbus to the 30,000 student campus of Ohio State. Well, then it's very hard to go back. And the classic song about that from World War I is, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? And, that's very much what we're talking about here, that, you have a different perspective and things will change. And of course, the fact that our young men went to war and did end up seeing places like Paris and Rome and London, etc., did cause them to come back and change the face of America in the 20th century. They certainly did. So in paragraph 13, then you get stronger and more independent as your ego expands, and the more unconscious is pushed into the background, and it reaches instinctual atrophy. And so it gives you freedom, but it has a tendency toward hubris, so it can also get you knocked down. And, obviously that's not particularly good. And so what Dr. Edinger emphasizes in one of the 2 lectures is that you're between this rock and a hard place, and on one side is hubris and inflation, and the other side is the rocks. And it's the classic in the classic story of Ulysses. It's Scylla and Charybdis, going between Scylla and Charybdis. You have to go right down the middle, because if you go too far one side or too far the other side, you're going to go on the rocks. Because if you're too prideful, then you're going to come down. And if you don't have enough self-esteem and ego, then you're going to come down because of depression, or you're already down, but you won't be able to get up. And so what happens is the collapse of people with weaker ego, members of the society. So what Dr. Jung mentions is that Yang starts to turn into yin at 12 o'clock noon. And so this is a cycle that's always going on. You can't escape it. And we've pushed things very far on the logos side in Christian societies for the last 2,000 years, and that's starting to be problematic. Or not starting to be, it's been problematic for 150 years. Okay, paragraph 14. Psychologists see these movements in life. For example, the successful businessman becomes like a querulous old woman, and this destroys him. Somebody who's extremely successful has made great successes. Suddenly he becomes embittered and doesn't live well after that. A one-sided exaggeration leads to yin, and that's the reaction from the unconscious pulling you down, actually. And so if you believe where there's a will, there's a way, that's what the Third Reich believed. Okay, that's the point that Dr. Jung makes about the Third Reich, that they believe where there's a will, there's a way, and so they thought that they could take over the world, and others have different ideas about that. And so what happened is all the crockery got broken, and it can happen again to us. In fact, it's 8 minutes after 9, so I don't know if our minute is up yet. So anyway, so consciousness and the will are our highest achievements, but what use is morality that destroys the man? Morality can be a sign of barbarism, and he says wisdom is better. Okay, so the point about the whole Secret of the Golden Flower is it's about wisdom and the biological development of wisdom over time. So paragraph 15, one-sidedness leads to breakdown. An example would be Florence Foster Jenkins, and I've likened her to certain other famous personality in our country. And what happens is the unconscious is in full revolt. And so I don't know if you've seen the movie, but I'll just give you a quick pressy on it. Florence Foster Jenkins was an heiress who had lots and lots of money. She had plenty of money. And so what she would do is she liked the opera and she wanted to sing opera. So every year she would hold a sort of like a talent show at the Waldorf Astoria for all her rich friends. And because she was a big patron of the Metropolitan Opera, everybody would go, and when she sang, they'd clap very much. And this got to be a bigger and bigger deal. And so actually you can find on Wikipedia, if you find Florence Foster Jenkins, you can find a picture of her singing opera in her living room, and you can see the pained faces, pained look on people's faces as she's doing that. And so what happens is her husband ultimately hires the town hall, Carnegie Hall, for a performance. And she's like 70 years old at this point. And she gets herself all worked up to do this performance of opera singing. And her husband has to pay soldiers and sailors to come to the Carnegie Hall to hear her sing. And they've just come back from the war. They're not, they're pretty rough guys. They don't have any women with them. They've just come back from World War II. And so they're pretty rough in their response to her. And, in the end, she discovers what the actual reviews are of her performance. And when that happens, she dies. It's unclear whether she died immediately the next day or very shortly after that. But she simply couldn't take it. And so anyway, human reason is helpless. In this situation, if somebody gets that inflated about their prowess, and she was obviously inflated because all of her friends were going to the Waldorf and to her apartment over and over again and clapping and cheering when she sang. And ironically, the Met now says that the most popular recording from their gift shop is her performance at Carnegie Hall. Let's say it's not particularly nice. And there's also a French movie version of this, which is, I don't remember what it's called, but you can probably find it if you Wikipedia Florence Foster Jenkins. You can find the French version. I've watched both of them, and the American one that has Meryl Streep playing Florence Foster Jenkins is really terrific. So anyway, but that shows that one-sidedness can lead to breakdown. If somebody pumps up your ego way beyond where it should be, then you can have a problem. And Dr. Jung's point is that the Chinese never separated yay and nay so far. They stayed in the original proximity, and so they were freer from the opposites. And this is also true among the Indians with their ideas of nirvana. And the point is that the instinctual layer and the spiritual layer never got so far separated as they are here in the West. In paragraph 16, Dr. Jung is talking about that he has the same issue with his patients, and he says it's a mistake to take up Chinese yoga. Now, this is a century ago. So in fairness, yoga is here and it's here to stay. And so please don't take my comments as saying that yoga isn't here to stay, because it is. And but Dr. Jung's position at the time, with very little knowledge about the East, was that it would strengthen the European side of the will against the unconscious, and it would cause an intensified neurosis. But here's where I was going to show the picture of my great-grandmother in her black dress and say the point of departure is different, and so you have to be aware. And so American women were wearing full-length black outfits 150 years ago, and so we can't just necessarily expect that Muslim women are going to change like that. It may take a century to change. And he says that changes are only appropriate where consciousness has changed organically, and it becomes an essential condition, a thing that is absolutely necessary. And he says that abnormal development achieves nothing, and I make the example of religion in the USSR. Russia in the 20th century banned religion, but as soon as the USSR fell, religions were back. All the cathedrals were rebuilt very quickly, like in 3 years or 5 years. And so you can't just take cultural things away from people and expect them to change. If you diverge too far from the unconscious, you have neurosis problems. And his point is that the way of development has little meaning before the midpoint of life, and that you have to have a strong enough ego. And so, the point is, we shouldn't get going on looking at this individuation thing before we have a strong enough ego to control our spirits, because the spirits are coming up, the good side and the bad side. May the force be with you, strong enough to select for the good. And if your ego isn't strong enough, you can go off the deep end, and that's a problem. And so Dr. Jung is talking about the fisherman metaphor, where the fisherman pulls up a fish that's too big for his boat. Maybe better push it back. And Dr. Edinger wrote a whole book about it, about Moby Dick, and how, that fish was too big for Captain Ahab's boat, and it took him down. And, in my own experience, when I wrote my novel, part of which was contained erotica, and I didn't know what I was going to do with that. That was really a fish that was too big for my boat at the time. And so I took that novel, I completed it. I had no choice. My self forced me to finish that novel. And whether it was myself or my shadow or my anima, or maybe all three, probably was all three at one time or another during the 8-month period, but I had no choice but to finish the novel. But once I did, I put that novel in a drawer for 21 years. I finally did publish it on Kindle, but now I can explain what it is, which I couldn't do in 1993 when that happened to me. And so that's an example of how you can fish up something from the unconscious that's too big for your ego at the time to control. Gray says, our egos need to be strong, not safe. Yes, that's right. They need to be strong. And, but the spirit is going somewhere in all of us, and we need to pay attention to that. And and make sensible, conscious decisions about what we bring into our life and what we don't. And I didn't want to bring that novel into my physical life at that time. Actually, I did, and I was a little bit leery about showing it to women, and my wife refused to read it until I'd had 10 women read it. And so I actually, over a period of time, had 100 women read it, more than. And it happened that I was in a business that was all women at the time, so there were a lot of women around to read. And they all loved it. So I said, okay, well, maybe that's okay then. But from my point of view, circa 1993, I didn't think it was okay at the time. But anyway, the point is that if you enter into the individuation process before you're ready, it can be injurious to your health. And so just beware of that. Each of us has to make our own judgment on that. Okay, so now, go on here. Trying to remember what other things I set up. Oh, yeah, okay. That's way back here. Okay, we have a ways to go yet. Okay, so Dr. Jung's reason for looking for a new way was that he didn't have an answer for what he was finding vis-a-vis the collective unconscious. And what he said was that there's some issues that are insoluble without violence to one or the other side of your nature. And what he believed was that at bottom, nothing is insoluble, okay? That remember the psychoid layer now, the unus mundus, which is at the deepest level of the psyche, nothing is insoluble. Jerome says, what did you learn about yourself from the novel? I'll tell you what, Jerome, there are a couple of videos on that topic. I think I have to refer you to those. I actually talked about it twice in group in the reading group. And so what I will do is give you some links and ask you to go take a look at that. And in the one that I'll give you, there's a link to the first one. I spoke about it twice in group. And let's see. Okay, here's the one where I talked about it most thoroughly. Because this was 2 months after so here's the 2 months later discussion, and let's see if I find the other one here quickly. Another one. I think this might be the first one, which was actually 3 months earlier when I had talked about it. So rather than take a lot of time here, I think it's probably better to just ask you to go and take a look at those things. Because I learned a lot. Let's be perfectly clear. I learned a lot about myself and a lot about what had been cooking in my mind for 30 years, believe it or not. And the fundamental idea of this novel, which is available in the Dropbox, so I'm not trying to sell it to anyone, but it is also available. It's available on Amazon. Okay, so that's the name of the novel, and I wrote it under a pen name. My pen name is, that's my pen name, and the fundamental principle of it was that Michael Crichton had been interviewed by, I think, the Wall Street Journal at one point about how you go about writing a novel. And I'd read this article, and he was talking about Jurassic Park, and he said, well, the way you write a novel is you ask a question, and then you answer it. And his question for Jurassic Park was, what if you could bring dinosaurs back to life? What then? And so now we're having, I think, the second or third sequel after the original Jurassic Park coming out in July, where we see what can happen, at least in fiction. But my issue was a bit more realistic, which was when I was 15 years old and living in Kamakura, Japan, we had a live-in housekeeper who was 23, a young woman. And I asked my father one day, why Michiko was here with us. Why was Michiko-san here, living here? And he said, well, young farm girls in Japan come to Tokyo to earn their dowry, that quote unquote. So it wasn't a question, he just made that statement. And that statement had cooked in my unconscious for 30 years. And so on this one particular day, which I describe on one of those videos, I was thinking about Crichton's dictum that you should ask a question. And I, since I have a lot of experience in Japan, I lived there 8 years, I said, well, what if such a young woman came to Tokyo? What would that actually be like? Because obviously our live-in housekeeper was very lucky to get a job and live in with a American Navy family in Kamakura, but most young women that come to Tokyo would have a much rougher experience than that. And that's what I had learned in my second session of 5 years when I lived in Tokyo and built a company there. And so I said, well, what if one of those girls came to Tokyo and to earn her dowry and ended up as the first woman prime minister of Japan? That was the question. And what would that life be like? So the novel really covers a period of 60 years in her life, which was ages 15 to 75. And so that's the fundamental story, but it's a lot more rough and ready than that. So I'll just leave it at that for now. And you can watch the videos where I get into it more. Okay. So let's see. So one of the key points that Dr. Jung makes about neurosis and how to deal with it is that you can grow out of a problem. In other words, you get a new level of consciousness that's higher and wider. You get a new level of maturity, and then what seems like an insoluble problem loses its urgency. And so it isn't solved logically on its own terms. And so I make a note here that my issue with Jordan Peterson's emphasis on logos, I don't really feel I need to debate him on this point because it's going to solve itself. because there are enough people that aren't quite so heavily weighted on the logo side who will adjust that in society over time. And so the problem that I observe in his presentation is that it's going to lose its urgency as people grow up. And meanwhile, he's been very helpful to me, there no doubt, and I still need help psychologically from time to time, and he's very good, and he's very good about his perspectives on religion, I think. And so, 98% of the time I'm very happy with if I watch a Jordan Peterson video. But I chafe a little bit when he gets a little bit too logosy. But then I think, well, maybe this is for men who haven't been properly fathered, and they need that kind of guidance. But a rigid father's guidance doesn't always win. I remember, and often life gets in the way and experience changes your perspective. But I remember Representative Scalise, when he was shot last summer. Well, he's the one that was shot last summer, but so I'm just bringing your attention to who I'm talking about. Now, before that, though, one time, I think it was Bannon went up on Capitol Hill, and the president wanted Congress to vote in a certain way, which they didn't really want to do, and they got the Republican caucus had gotten quite a talking to by Steve Bannon, and Scalise came out of that meeting and said, I haven't been spoken like that since my father did it to me when I was 18 years old, and I didn't do what he wanted either. And so anyway, perceived problems can be grown out of. So at the lower level of consciousness, you can have wild conflicts and outbursts. So you can remember your teenagers, for example, how they can be pretty wild, and yet once they get more experience, they change. And so at the higher levels of consciousness, then you get new and stronger life urges with your maturity. And so it becomes like a storm down in the valley seen from a mountaintop at a higher level. And in Buddhism, they talk about the sky-like quality of mind, where they talk about when you're taking off in an airplane and you look down on the clouds down below you, and all the problems that you saw before are down there, but everything's cool up above you. It's beautiful blue sky. And so in Buddhism, they teach you it's all illusion. Well, okay, it's not all illusion, but you learn how to deal with it, whatever it is. So the old saying that most Americans know is, don't sweat the small stuff, it's all small stuff. And it's hard to say that to a teenager. And so I remember one of the things that really ripped me when I lived in Japan as a teenager, I was in 10th to 12th grades there, and all of my friends had motorcycles. Now, these were pretty pathetic motorcycles, because if you were under 18 in Japan, you could only get a license for a 50cc motorcycle. But nonetheless, we called them motorcycles in those days. And so all of my male friends in my Navy high school in Yokohama had motorcycles except for me. And my father forbid me to have one. And I was really ripped about that at the time. And I guess I still am at some level, although I've grown out of it. But anyway, in the fullness of time, then when I was about 30, the man across the street, who was also 30 and the father of two, killed himself on a motorcycle. And I said, oh, maybe it was not a bad thing that I wasn't on a motorcycle. It made me grow up and learn different things to do, and I had to learn how to get around Japan through public transportation systems, which was a very good experience. There's a lot to talk about there, but so the issue is that we're both the mountain and the valley. So I don't know if this is a Christ quote or a Jung quote, but the quote is, "I know that I suffer." Okay, so I suffered over the motorcycle decision. But, in the fullness of time, it wasn't that big of a deal. But what made it a little bit bigger deal was that when I left for college, my parents stayed in Japan another 15 months. And 3 weeks after I left for college, they bought a motorcycle that my brother could drive. And I said, what? Anyway, such is life. Okay. So paragraph 18, Dr. Jung is saying that all the greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally insoluble. Now, that's a big idea to think about, but what he says is they express the necessary polarity inherent in every self-regulating system, and they're not solved, they're outgrown. You get a new thing from obscure possibilities, things that you weren't expecting, but something new comes up out of unknown potentialities. And so in paragraph 19, then he's talking about the new thing, and he says that it never comes only from the outside or the inside. It can't be pigeonholed, and it turns out to be strangely appropriate expression of the total person. And I admit it. Now I get around in Japan, like a native, more than a native. I mean, when I left after living there 8 years, I called myself Edo Ko, which means son of old Japan, and it was definitely true that Japanese friends from outside of Tokyo would come to visit, and I would know far more about Tokyo and be able to take them on tours. So paragraph 20 then, the advice from the Golden Flower is let things happen. Consciousness is forever interfering with psychic processes. And consciousness will have numerous objections, and you're better off just letting, going with the flow. I mean, that's a Taoist point of view, but, things will change, and, a new thing will emerge. And he says in paragraph 21, there's a temptation to categorize, which, all of that logos and all that scientific method wants to categorize everything. And the point is that the conscious activity needs to be switched off. I mean, that's what the Tao is to go meditate, right? And just see how this comes up. Because before we get to the end of tonight, I'm just going to show you this one other picture here that I set up for you. Okay, so when I was 15 years old, I moved to Kamakura, Japan, which is the home of Daibutsu, the great Buddha. And I've had three perceptions about this great Buddha over my lifetime. The first was when I was 15, I'm saying, what is this guy doing, and why do we care? And of course, no one when I was 15 years old was trying to explain it to me. But when I was there in my mid to late 30s and around 40, I did understand by that time that he was meditating. And now, and in my 70s, I understand the value of meditating. Okay, so this Buddha has been sitting here since 1295, and it was originally surrounded by the largest wooden building in the world. It relinquished that honor in 1492, the same year that Columbus came to the New World, or maybe it was 1495, but about that same time. So now the largest building in the world is around a great Buddha in Kyoto. But in 1495 or so, a tsunami came in, and it came all the way up to this great Buddha and washed the building away. Now, that must have been one hell of a tsunami, because I've climbed the hill that this Buddha is on, and it must be at least 200 feet above sea level. And Kamakura is a beach town, so it's, there is a beach there on Sagami Bay, but for a tsunami to carry away the building that surrounded this Buddha is just phenomenal. It must have been really terrible, way more than the Fukushima tsunami. And so, anyway, it's bronze, and it's been sitting there for 800 years, whatever. Let's see. So we, in paragraph 22, then, we tend to develop tenuous webs of fantasy, and it's usually one way. We ought to write them down. And these fantasies, we should model them or draw them or in some way, because they're foreign to the conscious mind, so they come up in dreams also. And you should accept whatever comes up, because that's coming from yourself, from the psyche. And you have to let that happen until the cramp is removed. I'm gonna just change the scene now. This is my contact information in case you're interested in the Dropbox for the public group, or the Dropbox for the advanced group. And so here in this paragraph 22, I think what he's talking about is people who are having a depression, some sort of depression or something like that, and they have a cramp in their style, or they don't have enough self-esteem, or whatever. And what Dr. Jung's advice for people was to draw it, or to draw a mandala, or write it down in some way, until you can let things happen more, until things can be more instinctual again. And the problem that he was always faced with in Europeans was the people had removed themselves so far from instinct that they couldn't live happily, basically. And so one of the things he was trying to do was to reestablish that connection on the instinct to spiritual continuum there. And you need to accept whatever comes along. So this is why my little trick of the adult coloring book can work, because if you just, let your psyche decide what color is going to go in that square, once your psyche knows that you're paying attention to it yourself, then you're going to get more, and you'll start to get a flood of information. I'm sort of interested myself here in turning on the television and finding out what's happening in Singapore. So paragraph 24, Jung says, we must accept occupations which come to us. When things come, we understand them from the ground up, and we have to hang on. But this can swing too far. And so, I thought my thing would be being a lawyer. And for the longest time, I thought that was the right thing for me. And so I went to law school, which I enjoyed very much. It was an interesting challenge. And I practiced law for 5 years. And what I found out was that I detest the practice of law. And so then you have to find another line of work. And, I did it in a surprising way, but I definitely did it. And so I guess at this point, let's see. All right, so one of the things that Jung says in paragraph 25, and this goes back now to my Buddha here, is that a Westerner has authority against him in meditation, because at a higher level you don't have the rear guard or the shelter that would come up if you had built up to meditation instinctively. So yes, you can meditate, and yes, it can be great for you, but a Chinese would meditate in an entirely different way. And he says that, your conscious integrity stops an absurd misadventure. So some ideas can come up that maybe aren't too good. And you can imagine, as a 15-year-old boy, any number of ideas could have come up in my mind about what I was going to do about Japan and my life in Japan and so on. And ultimately, I did have to go back as a businessman and play that experience out as an expatriate. And I did it. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. I have another statue to show you that's about the goddess of mercy, but I'm going to leave that for next week. Are there any other questions before I terminate, so that I can go see if we still have a relationship with Singapore? If not, I will sign off for the evening, and we'll be back here again 1 week from tonight at 8:30 p.m., and we'll go on with paragraph 26 of The Secret of the Golden Flower. So any other thoughts? Guess not. Seeing none, I'm going to terminate, and thank you for joining me. And now we can all run to the television set and see what's going on. It'll be interesting.